Yep, should be good. Awesome. Well, Steve, thank you so much for agreeing to come on and spend some time with us today here at Young Apologetics.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I personally cannot be more excited for this conversation. I took a pretty keen interest in near death experiences maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and since they've really just been a point of fascination for me. So when my co-blogger Devin said he had emailed you and said, "Would you be interested in chatting with Steve?" I said 100%. So cannot be more excited for the conversation. Thanks for coming on. Before we jump into NDEs, though, I wanted to definitely give you some time. Just tell us a little bit about your background and what you do now.
Sure, I'm a professor teaching at Kennesaw State University, and just a little bit north of Atlanta. Fast-growing university, has about 45,000 students. I'm in interdisciplinary studies, which is good for this type topic because there's so many realms of research that intersect with it. So I teach Introduction to
Mhm.
Religion and an advanced class called Death, Dying, and Afterlife. So I can use actually my research because my dissertation was on deathbed experiences. So it's neat to be able to teach in my area of expertise.
Yeah, that is awesome. Now, is Kennesaw State, is that a religious university?
No, it's just a public Georgia State University, like the University of
Okay, yeah.
Georgia or Georgia Tech. hmm
Yeah, no, that's cool, and I think that's probably an interesting kind of point to be because I'm assuming, do you have to teach from kind of an agnostic point of view when you're evaluating, NDEs and when you teach religion?
I don't know that I have to, but you're supposed to, at a university, be able to talk about what you think about things. But I do approach
Yep.
it from I'm not preaching, I'm teaching. And so I approach it from the standpoint of let's read things on both sides of issues. I'm not trying to push them into my beliefs, but I'm saying let's evaluate it. And then I let the students evaluate one another on a forum when they respond to readings. And then I just keep in touch with them during the week. So they really like that freedom to actually think. Sometimes I'll say, wow, this is the first class I've really been allowed to think for myself, and I teach them a little about critical thinking and how to
Mhm.
evaluate things so that they practice it. Rather than reading something to figure out what's going to be on the test, number one, or number two, what does the teacher want me to say? And I learn so much more if they're candid because I learn how people think.
Absolutely. Oh, that's really cool. What personally drew you to philosophy? Was there, a certain point in your life when you took a fascination with or decided, you wanted to study it and teach it, or was it kind of a gradual thing?
I made a commitment to Christ my sophomore year in high school on a retreat that I went on because the girl I liked was going, and I heard things presented in such a way that I thought, if God loves me, what am I doing fooling around outside of His will and missing out on His best? So I made some decision at that point. I didn't grow up in what I would call a real strong Christian family. It's not something we talked about in the home. But I kind of felt like the biblical worldview was good at the time. I'd not questioned it that much. So interestingly for me, my questioning started after I made that decision. And I would hear people slamming the faith in one way or another. And I would say, well, that what if they're right and I'm wrong? I'm a naturally skeptical guy who is not self-assured with things naturally. And so the only way I could work through my doubts was to read the best of both sides, try to think them through, and that's what relieved my doubts in the end. But this was a year's process. I mean, I was reading things while I was in high school. Then when I went to college, I went to three different undergrad schools that were very diverse, two graduate schools, ended up with three graduate schools concerning my um, for my PhD, but I was taking classes like at the University of Georgia on logic and ethics and comparative religions, philosophy, psychology of religion, whatever I thought Christians would have the hardest time with, because I wanted to make sure I understood the other side from people who actually believed that and were teaching it. So I went through all this. That's just the kind of person I am. So that's what naturally I was taking a lot of philosophy classes, but more specifically philosophy of religion, because I want to know, is there a God? Has he revealed himself to man? I'm a seeker. Jesus said, "Seek and you shall find." So I was seeking spiritually. I was praying. But I was also seeking intellectually, reading very deeply in these areas. So that was my motivation. It wasn't so much like I thought I was going to be out here doing interviews in my life. I just wanted to know for my own assurance.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, was there are there certain philosophers or apologists that have, inspired you or you consider to be kind of like pillars that you've looked up to and read a lot of their works, really from any time period and at any point in your life even?
Well, I've read people from all kinds. Well, I'm getting a little feedback now. I'm getting a echo. Can I click echo cancellation?
Yeah, if that's an option. Did that pop up?
It says it can't be changed. Now I don't hear it, so maybe we're okay. So,
I'll make sure to mute.
okay, that'll be fine. So, philosophers that I really like, John Warwick Montgomery was very good. He comes from more of a legal background. I enjoyed his writing, particularly William Lane Craig. I studied under him up at Trinity when he was teaching there, and I just felt like he was a nice guy. He had very high standards. We went through Copleston's History of Philosophy there in two different semesters, and he's just not a flashy guy as far as you know debating and speaking. He was just simply a great scholar who had done his homework, and I appreciated that about him. He had a PhD in um, a PhD in philosophy from the University of Birmingham, England, where he studied the cosmological argument and then studied the resurrection under Pannenberg at the University of Munich, Germany. He just went through the best of schools, difficult, but I appreciate his precision, his documentation, the fact that he thoroughly thinks things through and interacts with the other side fairly.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really cool. You studied under him. I personally take a lot of inspiration from him, and I know a lot of other people who do as well. So that's pretty unique experience to be able to actually study under him. Um, well, to jump into NDEs a little bit, I guess to start, what made you interested in those on the onset when you first started looking into them? And I know you said you wrote your dissertation on them.
Right, and this was later in life. Interestingly, so with all that study of apologetics and philosophy and all the things I was studying, I'd never even run across near-death experiences during my college years or high school years. I just assumed that this was something emotional that was happening in a person's life. And if it had any kind of evidence, the evidence was probably solely for the person who had the experience. And since I'd not had an experience like that, that really wouldn't be evidence to me. So about probably 12 years ago, a relative wanted me to read the little book Heaven is for Real about the pastor's child who had had an experience, and a movie was later made out of it. And I read it as a favor. I really didn't want to read it, but I read it, and I thought, well, that's a good story. It's kind of moving, and yeah, it seems like they're a decent family. But hey, you got the money motive of writing a book and publishing it, and I don't know the family, so it's not really strong evidence for me at all. Hardly evidence at all for a person who's got a skeptical mind like me. But in the book, there was a blurb by Dr. Long, who said, who has the NDERF site where he's collected like 5,500 near-death experiences now. But he was saying, in my research, the cases that I've come upon are consistent with what the little boy is saying. And I thought, somebody's been researching this? Well, I want to get into I don't want to read little paperback books of people's experiences or listen to YouTube videos that I don't know where they came from or have any kind of. I want to know if serious researchers have been researching this. So I began to read. I read Moody's book from Life After Life from 1975, where he had interviewed personally 150 people. And then Dr. Sabom had done a more scientific study as a cardiologist, a very skeptical cardiologist who didn't believe. He thought they were all hogwash when he heard Moody's book. Um, and then he came to think, wow, my evidence is showing me that these people have actually been outside their bodies. So as I studied, not just listening to YouTube, but actually reading the best researchers, Van Lommel in the Netherlands, in Holland, where he was where most of the people don't even believe in the afterlife. So you couldn't really say, oh, well, these are just people's expectations. So as I began to read, I thought, this is really powerful stuff. And I couldn't stop. So I haven't stopped for 12 years. While I was studying that, I came across a study in the 1950s and 1960s by Osis and Harrelson, two researchers. By the way, this research is not coming out of seminaries and pastors. This is just secular, typically researchers that have found something that's quite astounding and said, this is really important. So Osis and Harrelson studied deathbed experiences or deathbed visions, and they did an excellent study both in the United States and then compared that to people's experiences in India. So when I saw all those, I thought, okay, after I wrote a book on the research regarding near-death experiences, my book was called Near-Death Experiences as Evidence for the Existence of God in Heaven. I tried to write it in a popular way, but just documented it relentlessly so that people wanting to follow my steps could actually get back to the research. So when I saw that there was research on deathbed visions, which not as many people were talking about, I thought that would make a good PhD dissertation. So I went ahead and went for my PhD at a place that would allow me to study those, and I was shocked. I thought this would be like a tidy theme that I would have, maybe find 100 sources or so. And when I got up to 500 and 600 sources, I thought this has really been researched. People need to be aware of what's going on with people at death, and these visions of deceased loved ones, of angels. They in some recent study in a hospice unit where they interviewed the people every day to find out what they were experiencing, over 80% of the dying in the hospice unit were having these visions. And some of them come with corroborating evidence. So this has just been very powerful for me. Totally unexpected. In fact, when I started getting into the research, I didn't really expect to find much there. And I was just shocked at the evidence that was there for both God and the afterlife.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there one thing I've noticed is I've kind of like you looked into different research sites and people who are constantly documenting NDEs is there seems to be so much similarity, like kind of you mentioned, among different people's experiences, which is a very interesting, thing to look at and think like if everyone's having the same experience,
Mm-hmm.
something's binding those experiences kind of together somehow, some way, whatever that is. And that was my next question for you is what would you say are the most common things that people experience when they do have a documented NDE? Because I saw a lot of similarities, and I was curious, kind of what you thought were sort of a couple common things people would, seem to experience when they have an NDE.
Well, Moody noticed these when he published his book, Life After Life. I think he actually coined the phrase near death experience. And basically, you'll have a person who, let's say they've had a cardiac arrest, cessation of breathing, cessation of heartbeat, which is called clinical death. Very quickly, your brain shuts down and is really incapable of consciousness and laying down memories. And yet, people would come back from these telling about these things that were so extraordinary and so real to them. Some would even call it realer than real. That's one of the characteristics that they just couldn't forget it. It was like it would happen 20 years ago, and they said, I can tell you the whole thing. Well, how is your brain on hyperdrive when it should have been severely compromised? So basically what I did was I said, let's do this scientifically and just say you've got the dying brain hypothesis over here that says really this can be explained as hallucinations or dreams or something that goes on physically in the dying brain, or the afterlife hypothesis, which would say that, hey, maybe these people really came out of their bodies and were experiencing something on the other side, whatever you call that. So you look at those two and you say, okay, well, it's realer than real at a time when their brain should have been severely compromised, if functional at all. Well, that seems to fit better with saying that there is a soul that can separate from the physical brain and physical body. But people will report coming out of their bodies, looking down, maybe seeing themselves, and it takes them a while to notice, oh my goodness, that's me down there. How is this happening? And then they may experience just astounding peace at a time when you'd think they would be terrified. Um, See a being of light, who almost all refer to as God, maybe angels, maybe deceased relatives. These are all what I call core parts of the experience. It may only be, each one may be in only 20% or 30% of the experiences, because some people will just pop out of their body, observe what's going on in the accident scene, experience a lot of peace, maybe see some heavenly type features around them, and then come back into their body. But others will go on and have a life review. Some will come to a point of no return where they say, well, if you go over this line, that means you're going to the other side. You need to make a decision. And they'll make a decision to say, okay, let's come back. And then they find themselves in a body. Now that's very distinct from dreams, if you think about it. I actually got up each morning for a period of time and just wrote down what my dreams were about. In every situation, and think about it, you're in the listening audience, track your dreams. In your dreams, it just kind of starts off in the middle of a story. It doesn't start off with me in my dream, okay, I just went to sleep and now I'm having a dream, or that I just woke up and had it. I'm in the middle of something, and it ends in the middle of something, maybe the middle of a conversation or the middle of the story. Whereas a near-death experience has a distinct beginning where you see yourself coming out of your body, and it has a distinct end where people will decide to come back, or they know they're coming back, and then it's over, as if it's like a movie that has a producer. Somebody's directing this thing, very different from a dream or a hallucination in those respects. But yes, this whole thing of not just in America, where people have a diversity of beliefs about the afterlife, why would there be this consistent pattern? That expectations are very different, concerning the afterlife. And Christians, for example, I'm a Christian, but when I'm dying, I'm thinking that what's going to happen is what happens to a person after their final death. I'm not expecting a halftime event that I come back from that's quite different from that. So I don't think Christians are typically expecting something like that. Atheists are not expecting it. Why would people from all kinds of backgrounds and then all countries be having these very similar experiences? I think that lends itself to the afterlife hypothesis that, well, maybe what they're experiencing is actually real. It's not something their mind is informing.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you say that as you learned more and more and researched NDEs more and more, did that ever cause you to be skeptical about your Christian faith, or would you say that kind of pushed you towards it more? Um, because I agree, there are some things with NDEs that I think Christians have a hard time applying theology and doctrine to. An out of body experience is a good example. Seeing yourself, like, that's not necessarily in the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of
True.
verse for verse, or like the option to die and then be asked, do you want to go back or do you want to proceed? Like, so just certain things like that. And so I'd just be curious, from your experience, kind of where did that lead you, and kind of how do you reconcile some of that?
Uh, a couple of other very common features that I'd say are part of the core is that often on the other side, people report that they weren't really speaking like we're speaking now, but they were just speaking directly mind to mind with an angel or with God or something. Well, that's totally unexpected for me, and I think for most of us. Children will go to the other side and report seeing angels, but when they describe them, typically those angels don't have wings. Well, number one, how did they know they were angels if they didn't have wings? And if it were informed by the culture, why wouldn't it be the cultural description where they always have wings? The Bible never says all angels have wings. There's some winged creatures that are seen on the other side, but they're not called angels. And obviously, not all angels in the Bible are said to have wings. Um, so why do they have that? So I mean, all this is so unexpected. So with my Christian faith, I thought, well, yeah, the Bible and Christian doctrine does not say very specifically, oh, when you go to the other side in a vision, you'll be speaking mind to mind, but it's not against my faith. I think it's consistent with my faith because we see throughout the Bible visions of angels where people are communicating with angels. We see in the transfiguration of Jesus where he was talking to long deceased saints from the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah. So why should I say, oh, well, when a Christian dies and has a visionary experience temporarily, I don't see anything against doctrine, against Christian doctrine about that. And so many things, in fact, in my most recent book where I compare Christianity, Christian doctrine with near-death and deathbed experience research, if you use the best of near-death, deathbed research and compare it with, I'd say, more conservative Christian theology, you have to be beware of the word conservative. Everybody's got a bit different ideas to whether that's good or bad. But let's say historic Christian theology, I don't really see a problem there. I think where people get into the problems is number one, they assume that what happens in a halftime experience ought to replicate what happens at your final death. So that you're coming before God, deciding whether, you're listening to God talk about whether you're getting to heaven or not, or, things that you think will happen at the end of time. Well, this is not a final death. This is a vision midstream, which may be more like the Apostle Paul experienced in 2 Corinthians 12 when he talked about he didn't know if it was in his body or out of his body. He saw paradise/heaven. He uses both terms. It was a powerful experience. Doesn't give much detail. It sounds like it was ineffable, which is another common characteristic of near-death experiences. But in that book, I found like 47 different areas that are very consistent with Christianity. I mean, you think about it. There's a God. There are angels. In distressing near-death experiences, they're demonic-like creatures that are malevolent in their intent. Some people are being punished on the other side in distressing experiences. There's a heavenly place. I'm actually calling it a vestibule of heaven because it seems like they come to a place where if they went across it, they would go into the actual paradise or heaven or whatever you want to call it of the interim period. There's not only a God, but it's a personal God. That comes against a lot of philosophical views of an impersonal creator, that's virtually one with the universe, like a pantheism or panentheism. It's not impersonal. Everybody sees a very personal God. And so I just think there's just so much that meshes together. And when you get into problems, it's when either you're thinking that we ought to experience what a person experiences in their final death, or they're just looking at experience after experience that Google and YouTube feed you, which is influenced by an algorithm. And that algorithm is influenced by what people like. And typically, people really probably like the experiences that go beyond the core experience and mesh with certain theologies that they like, which means that a lot of people are just looking at anomalous after anomalous near-death experience rather than looking at the core experience, which is again why I stuck with the best researchers rather than just looking at YouTube or reading paperback books by people who have a motive to enhance things a little bit to make it appeal to a certain audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Get more book sales. Um, why? So I was curious. Why do you think that? One thing I found myself wondering as I've looked into it is why do you think that it seems to me the majority of people who have an NDE or go through that experience, it's more of a positive experience. At least in terms of a lot of the research I've seen, it's more positive than negative. Like it's some people say 70, some people say 80% of the experiences tend to be more positive, and only like 10 to 20 tend to be a very negative, like frightening experience. And I can see people saying, especially, so I grew up Southern Baptist, and it's very
Hmm.
common, Southern Baptist belief that when you die, you're in eternal judgment and punishment, or you proceed to heaven. And this seems to maybe point that it's not that black and white. There might be some sort of a gray that happens when you die that we, like, kind of like we spoke about, don't have a perfect theology and doctrine for. Anyway, the question is why do you think it's typically positive, not negative?
Well, I'd question the premise first of all. I'd say we're not really sure what percentage are positive and which percentage are negative.
Okay.
Early on, a lot of researchers kind of ignored the distressing experiences. Um, and I think rightfully so, because if they're talking to people about what did you experience, it's hard for a lot of people to ever even share that they had an experience, even if it's good, because they're afraid people will think they're crazy. Especially in these early research. Now we've seen so many, people are more prone to say, if they're familiar with it, they'll say, "Oh, okay, well, a lot of people are experiencing this." But especially early on in the early decades, people weren't aware of it. You're not going to tell anybody. But especially with a distressing experience, that almost implies that you're a bad person and that you might be going to hell. That's not edifying to anybody. So I would suspect on like Dr. Long's NDERF site, where people just voluntarily put up their experiences, you're going to have very few that are really hellish. Um, and so and in fact, I didn't pay a lot of attention to those with my first book. I probably had a paragraph on them. Number one, they give me the creeps, and who wants to look at that? And my thesis was really saying, okay, I just want to look at the evidence of near-death experiences to see if they give evidence for the afterlife. So I didn't want to get into the question of is there a hell or something like that, just kind of irrelevant to where I was going in the book. But when
Got
I
it.
was trying to look at it in regard to biblical teachings, I thought, well, this is relevant to that. So I read some books on it. Now, so Dr. Moody put out his book. He acknowledged that some were distressing. Dr. Rawlings came along after that, who was a cardiologist, in fact, a very respected cardiologist. He was at the Pentagon for a while, a personal physician to some extremely important people there. And he was kind of a lukewarm believer, if a believer at all, probably didn't even believe in the afterlife. And one of his patients that was having heart problems, his heart kept stopping. He would resuscitate him, and each time he would resuscitate him, the patient would say, "Doctor, you've got to keep me alive because I keep going to hell every time when my heart stops." And so it happened several times. He got him resuscitated, but it really shook Dr. Rawlings because he had not really given all that much thought. He said this guy was so sincere that what he saw was not a hallucination, it wasn't a bad dream, but that he
Mhm.
was really experiencing a terrible, terrible thing. So Dr. Rawlings, he didn't really do a scientific study, and that's why a lot of people ignored him. But this is a respected guy. He's a thinker. He's not even just the cardiologist next door. He's way up there in cardiology and science. He estimated that if you talk to people immediately after their experience, rather than a retrospective look at somebody that happened 2 years ago, but right when it happened, that maybe up to 50% were experiencing a distressing experience. Now, again, this wasn't scientific. It was just his thoughts. But I'm just saying we really don't know what percentage are having that. After that, we've had a couple of people actually do better studies. Blessings in Disguise was written by a Dr. Romer, and she actually put a lot of the experiences out there of people that she personally interviewed about their distressing experiences. Her and Nancy Evans Bush, who wrote Dancing in the Dark, she had actually had a distressing experience and then eventually wrote about it. I think they would go more with 20% or so of the experiences are distressing. Now,
Hmm.
I think the problem of Christians goes back to this thing of expecting, okay, if this is going to be, if somebody died at death, they should experience judgment and everything. If they're a wicked person and unbeliever doing their own thing, or heaven, if they're a good person who's following God consistently and all this. Well, that again is your final death, what happens. This is a halftime experience. So Jesus said at one point, he was saying, love your enemies. Be good to bad people. He said, why do we do this? Because our Father in heaven, he is good. He is kind to evil and ungrateful men. Okay, well, look at Jesus, how he treated wicked people. I mean, tax gatherers were creeps during his time. And he's like talking nicely to them. He's showing love to the woman at the well who is living a very sinful life. So if God's end game is he's saying, okay, I really want everyone to come to repentance, to not experience, I want them to come to their repentance, and I don't want them to experience judgment in the end. Well, how does he bring people to repentance? Romans 2, Paul says, the kindness of God leads you to repentance. I think God's end game is he doesn't really want to take a Hitler and just give him a vision of God at the end and say, oh, look, here's a vision of hell. And Hitler says, okay, I don't want to go there. What do I have to do? Okay, yeah, I believe. Boom. I think he wants people there that have chosen him, and if you seek, you'll find. So what is he going to do if he wants more people in heaven? He's going to give them good experiences. He's going to show them his love. And I think a lot of people who are wicked, or some of them are wicked because they had bad experiences with what they thought was Christianity, but maybe is a very judgmental, unthinking Christianity. And God may want to say, listen, I love you. I love you. So to me, it doesn't complete their theology. Paul's vision on the Damascus Road didn't give him a complete theology of salvation. I think God doesn't want to bypass our seeking. So a lot of these people, after they've had an experience, they may say all kinds of weird things. They're trying to make sense of their experience. But if they actually end up seeking as a result, Jesus said, if you seek, you'll find. So to me, it makes sense that a loving God would give somebody a very loving experience of himself during a time that's one of the most disturbing points in their life, where they've had a terrible accident or a heart attack.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Yeah, I don't know if I've thought about it like that, actually. It's kind of like, this isn't necessarily the final game, the end game. This is, a point in time when God could influence you how he chooses to. And it's a good time for him to show you his love and, almost be evangelistic to someone who he's never been able to get the attention of for whatever reason. So that's really interesting. Um, do you have any favorite stories that maybe you've come across in your research over the years? And I know there's a lot of them, but maybe just one or two that have stood out to you.
Yeah, just so many of them are my favorites. And that's the astounding thing. Atheists like Shermer will say when somebody talks about a really wild experience, they say, well, there are billions of people in the world.
Hmm.
There are really weird things that are going to happen, when you look at anomalous situations. But when you see that, uh, like 4% to 6% of the population has experienced these things, and you read their experiences and you find they're so powerful to the people, to me, they're just astounding. I would have to say the Pam Reynolds case stands out as one, because it's not just that I'm looking for something heartwarming, I'm looking for evidence. You've got to understand.
Hmm.
So this really helped me evidentially. But the Pam Reynolds case, and you can see it online, the documentary that came out in the fall highlighted some of Pam Reynolds. She was actually studied in Dr. Sabone's second book that he wrote on near-death experiences, and he did the research into her. But she had a very risky brain surgery that required lowering her body temperature to about 50 degrees, draining all the blood from her head. And by 3 primary tests, a silent EEG, unresponsive brainstem, no blood flow through the brain, she's clinically dead. And she was being monitored constantly by an EEG, monitored also for an unresponsive brainstem. They wanted to make sure she was not conscious of anything going on. And she was clinically dead. So, and her eyes were covered, and she had 100 decibel clicks going on in her ear in order to help monitor the brainstem. She did not know what was going on during the surgery. Okay, we've got, and so Dr. Sabom went into this, actually talked to the surgeons. He said, I'm not even familiar with this procedure. But when she came out of it, the doctor who was there when she came to, she started talking about very specific things that happened during her surgery, like this one kind of saw that was in the shape of like a toothbrush or something, and how it worked. Extremely specific stuff that people don't really see on movies or TV. And he's like, doctors, we need to talk to this patient a little bit. And how did she know these things? How did she have extremely clear sight, sound, when she had those clicks going on? How did she know conversations, specific conversations that went on during the surgery? So to me, and there's been a lot of discussion. We'll have atheists and others who come back and say, now, wait a minute, maybe it happened before, maybe it happened afterwards. But when Sabom and others come back and say, now, wait a minute, this could not have happened. Look at the facts of the case. Pretty astounding. That's one that I look at through my research that I think is astounding. Gary Habermas, in his most recent book on the resurrection that came out this year, in his first appendix, he gives a whole bunch of near-death experiences with evidential value to them, well-documented, things along this line. So this is not a 1 in billions type thing. But as far as what impacts me, when I began to research this, like one time my mom told a relative of mine, she said, tell him what you're studying. And this is a relative, a cousin of mine, who is very well respected in the family. I know him. He's not crazy, okay? Taught history all his life, has a master's in history, very well respected guy. I told him I'm studying near-death experiences. He said, oh, I've had 3 of those. I said, really? Now, it turns out 2 of them were really, I think, angelic visitations when he was speeding along the road. He also built dragsters and raced them. And these middle Georgia roads are just long and straight, and he would enjoy them thoroughly. One time, he was about to crest a hill, and something in the back seat said, slow down. And he kind of looked back, why isn't anybody there? He kind of ignored it. And then it's kind of like a pinch on your shoulder by a granny, said, slow down. So he slows down as he crests the hill. He sees that there's a transfer truck coming toward him in one lane. Pulled off to the side was a truck that had to pull halfway off the road on another. And had he kept going his speed, it would have been almost certain wreck and death at the speed he was going. And then he said, at 3 o'clock one morning, I felt like I had a huge weight on my chest. And I came out of my body. I saw a tunnel of light in the corner of the room, visited with some celestial beings, great peace, I believe. I went back into my body, woke up with a cold sweat. Almost immediately, the phone rang, and it was a nurse from 90 miles away saying that my dad had just died of a massive heart attack. And he said, I didn't know. My dad was not in the hospital as far as I knew. He had had a checkup recently, seemed to be fine. I had no idea. What about that timing? Now, that was the first time I realized that, wow, if these experiences are so common, we've got them within our circles of trust. People that we've known for years, people in our family. So those became the most astounding ones to me, were people I knew that had experiences that actually had evidential value. And if I could tell a third, you see, I could go through so many, but one of them, there was a person who was a minister of men at one of my former churches. The pastor said, okay, you told me what you're studying. You ought to try to interview him. He doesn't tell anybody about this experience. He told me as his pastor, but interview him about it. Well, he had been in a sepsis condition where he was comatose and people didn't know whether he would live or die. During that comatose condition, he had a near-death experience where he was out of his body and was talking to two angelic figures discussing whether he should come back or not. And then they decided to come back, and he said there he was, comatose, and he's thinking, he's hearing and he said, wow, nobody knows whether I'm going to live or die, but I know I'm going to live. And I asked him several times in the interview, just how real was this? Was it like a kind of a vivid dream? And he'd say, no, Steve, it was real. And then I would come back and ask it in a little different way. Just what degree of reality was it? And finally, he leaned across the table and he said, Steve, it was as real. It was real. It was as real as me sitting across from you right now. And I thought, there's no reason for this guy to be lying to me. He's not writing a book about it. He's risking something by sharing this experience. I don't think he's lying. And had I had that experience, I think I'd be saying the same thing that he's saying. So if I've got reputable people all around me telling about their experiences, why should I wait for my own experience to believe that there's some reality to these? So it became something where the people I trusted most, when they started opening about their experiences, that's when the chill would run down my spine, and I'd say, okay, I've seen it in valid research that this is widespread, is going on. But now I'm seeing it face to face with others. That's just a confirmation of the fact of what I've seen in the research.
Yeah, wow. Wow. Those are the kind of stories that make you just have to stop and take a minute and think them over and run them back in your brain and let them just soak in a little bit.
Yes, I encourage
Um,
people that are reading about these to don't just read it and go on to the next thing. Think about it. Talk to the people that you're related to, and you'll find that people just hadn't been talking about these. And you'll find some
mhm.
wild experiences by people that you fully trust.
One thing I was curious about, how do you think, or I don't know if you have a theory on this, but why do you think that some people or most people say they do seem like the experience seems more vivid and real than their current reality on Earth? Like you've said a couple of times, like a more raw, real experience, like as real as me and you sitting here. Do you have any kind of theory on why it would seem like almost more real than our current reality?
I'm not sure why. I think that in some ways our brains are limiters.
Hmm.
And so when I'm driving, I don't notice everything that's going on. If I did, I couldn't drive. If I was thinking, wow, that limb's bent differently than it used to be, or look at that dog out there. I mean, I'd be running into cars everywhere. So in a sense, our brain limits us to be able to focus on certain things. It seems to me, and again, this is one of those unexpected things, but when people go to the other side, they'll say, wow, it's just like my mind was opened. And I could understand why I had cancer or why I was born into the family that I was born into. God is just. God is loving. How did they know these things? It was like they could see. One lady said that she could just see multiple degrees away when she saw something she had said that was good to a person and uplifting, or when she said something that was hurtful. She could see multiple layers of where this butterfly effect went. Now, we don't see that down here. So it seems to me that when when the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 13 that we see as in a mirror dimly now, but then we shall see face to face. I think once we're outside of the limitations of our physical brain, that our minds can see far beyond that. And that's just the view of reality, right? So I think that people are saying, wow, I was just more alive than ever. So if I think about that philosophically, how do I know that I'm not dreaming right now and talking to you? Well, I would say it's because when I'm dreaming, I do think it's real at that point. But when I wake up, I look back and say, yeah, that was a dream. Why was it a dream? The degree of reality now is much higher state than then. So when somebody says, okay, but when I was having that experience, that was even a higher level of reality. Again, that's an evidence that if this happened to me, I wouldn't be saying, well, I wonder if that was a dream or hallucination or if it were real. They just say, man, it was real. I'm telling you.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. What do you think, just playing, kind of the skeptical side for a second, have you, because I've read all kinds of theories on, some people trying to explain it in maybe naturalistic ways, or maybe trying to explain it in other religion ways, or in, other intelligent beings or aliens or whatever. Have you come across any theories that, you've maybe had a hard time with, or have caused you some degree of skepticism? Or, do you think there are any good arguments that maybe there are naturalistic ways that people experience NDEs? Just curious, kind of what
Well,
your
I try
thoughts
to
are
be
on that.
humble in my assessment because I think when we're
Mhm.
thinking scientifically, we're never all the way there. We never have all the facts together. So who knows? Maybe some naturalistic explanation will come along someday. I'll just say from the ones I've seen so far, they have not caused it. Just the evidence for the afterlife hypothesis, the data just seems to fit it so much better than any naturalistic theory that it weighs heavily in that favor. Um, it's just like when scientists studied the Big Bang in the throughout the 1900s. The evidence kind of accumulated over time. We've had almost 50 years of research now, a lot of research that's gone on with near-death experiences. So to me, when I look, and in the first one of the early sections of my near-death experiences book, I looked at the naturalistic theories. And they would say, oh, well, it's just caused by people's expectations. And I say, well, yeah, but look at the research. They've looked at them at multiple cultures. It's not the content of it is not predicted by a person's their sex, whether they're male or female, whether they're rich or poor, whether they're a Christian or non-Christian or atheist. It's not predicted by that. So why would that be? Then somebody will say, "Oh, well, it's kind of a DMT-like substance that probably emits in the brain when somebody's dying." And so, yeah, but number one, why would the same video come out of everybody unless it's informed by your expectations? That becomes a problem. What about shared death experiences where people who are not dying are actually experiencing something very similar, like my friend, like my relative Bucky? He wasn't dying. So how can the dying brain hypothesis, there wasn't any DMT-like substance shooting off in his brain, why is he experiencing that? And when you get into deathbed experiences, there are even more things that are happening at a long distance by people who are unaware, whose brains are fine, when they see like a crisis apparition. So somebody's died over in England that you haven't even been in touch with in months. You didn't even know they were sick. You have seemingly a vision of this person coming to say goodbye to you. It's extremely real. You may even write it down and say, on this day I had this thing because I think this person must have died. I just saw them in my bedroom, but physically they weren't there. How did that happen? And some researchers from Cambridge University as well as Harvard University, William James was involved with this research. Top-notch scholars, Sidgwick's, who even recently an intellectual biography was written on, very capable researchers. They surveyed 17,000 people in England around Oxford and Cambridge areas, and found out that these were quite common. In fact, it happened 440 times more than you would expect if it were just a chance happening, that they happened to see this person within 12 hours before or 12 hours afterwards, within that 24-hour period that had died, when you know from actuarial charts, I guess you would call them, research on the dying. Okay, they're the possibility that they would die during that 24-hour period. We know what that possibility is. Why did these people see that, and so many of them, that would take it way far beyond chance? So that's just kind of an
Yep.
example of how we're about. If you're the people that come up with the naturalistic theories, to me, in general, they've not studied the research or even looked at the meta-analyses of research that really show oxygen deprivation. Really, I mean, a lot of these people did not have oxygen deprivation. They were checking their oxygen, and we know what happens with oxygen deprivation. People's minds start getting muddled and this type thing. They keep saying these things, but they don't compare it to the actual research.
Yep. Yeah, to me, I think there's like nothing more compelling about it all than a lot of the experiences are similar and shared because, like you said, that really shows us that, if it was a random combustion of DMT and then whatever makes up you and your thoughts and experience and the things you watch and have seen in your life, then the experiences would be vastly different, I feel like, across people because everyone's so different, like you said, in different cultures and inputs that we constantly are reading and putting into our mind. Like it's crazy that so many of them are so similar.
So I would
Um,
say that, yes, that's one of the lines of evidence that's more consistent with the afterlife hypothesis. But I'd say there's almost a dozen lines of evidence for near-death experiences and about the same for deathbed experiences. And each one of them is quite compelling. But then when you put them together as a cumulative case, it's very strong.
yeah, absolutely. What would you say maybe are like the one or two other of your, I guess, favorite or best pieces of evidence that are the most compelling when you've looked at it?
Well, things like the one book was written on, I believe it was called Blind Sight, where they studied people who had had near-death experiences who were blind, many of them born blind. You would say, what do you think? Does everything just black to you? And they'd say, I don't know what black is. I can't see light or dark, so I don't know any of it. And yet they would report seeing things vividly during their near-death experience. Well, where does that come from? The brain doesn't even have those memories to pull from, much less, and there has been no sight. So, I mean, when the blind see, when the colorblind report seeing colors for the first time, this is all just so astounding to them. The fact that and I gave the line of evidence from uh, deathbed experiences, which are really
Mhm.
kind of several types of experience. But when people would see the deceased loved ones, how do you explain that timing? When you have people who are experiencing, like Bucky did, something from another person who has died, and the timing of it, they didn't know about it. How do you explain that? And even just as I mentioned earlier, the difference between in a dream, you're in the middle of this story that never really starts, never really ends. If it were a vision, if it were just a dream, you would expect the same thing. How does it have an actual beginning and an ending when your body doesn't know when consciousness is gonna happen? Um, Terminal lucidity is another thing that people have studied. And when I quote things, these are legitimate studies from legitimate scholars published in some of our best scientific journals. This is not coming, there's really very little of this in religious journals. This is all coming from hospice workers, from scientists, scientific journals, and you can just trace it through. There is a journal of near-death studies which concentrates on that and has given us a lot of good information through the years. But it's just one line of evidence after another that children, I would say, is one of the most compelling to me. When I mentioned the children who saw angels and said they didn't have wings, and one child said to her mom, um, her mom was asking what she was seeing, and she said, I'm seeing angels. And so the child, so the mom wanted to identify with her and said, well, I see them too. And the child said, so what do they look like? And the mom said, well, mine has great big wings on it and this and that. And she said, Mom, you don't have to lie to me. They don't have wings, you know. And you see children dying. Dr. Komp, she was a pediatric oncologist who was teaching oncology at Yale University, a skeptic, atheist, existentialist is how she described herself. But when she went into practice and began to see these children that were having experiences at death, to where, I mean, a child, you don't typically tell a child, oh, by the way, you might die. Well, what's death, Mommy? Well, you won't be able to see me again. You'll be somewhere. I mean, you just don't even explain that to a child. It's beyond their heads. They don't have a big, well-developed worldview. So when children start saying things out of nowhere, like, I'm seeing angels, or I just talked to Jesus, and he's about to take me to the other side, or I see this person who died, and maybe they don't even know that person had died yet. They withheld that information, and they see someone on the other side who is deceased. And you see children saying these things, and it's like they are excited about going to the other side, and they're trying to comfort their parents. This is quite extraordinary. And again, it's the kind of thing that you have to sit around and go, what is the best explanation for that? Why would children be saying these things? And why would it be so consistent? So Dr. Komp became a Christian as a result of this, and she wrote several books on it. It's a little book. It's a great one to read. Dr. Komp, A Window to Heaven.
A window to heaven, is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, gotcha. Wow. That's just, yeah, that's so crazy. I agree with the NDEs with children being really compelling. I know like Heaven is for Real obviously is one of the most cited ones, but even that one is just mind blowing. The painting of Jesus and then, having another person recognize that from another part of the world. It's so crazy. I guess there's a lot I want to ask. I've got one more question for you though.
We could have another interview
How has
sometime. There is a lot. That's why I've written 3 books on it so far. There's a lot to be said.
I would love to go out and read a few of your books and then have you back on in a couple months and kind of do a revision and a recap of what we've talked about. That'd be awesome.
Sure, if you're not up on money, I can send you free PDFs. I'm not writing this stuff for the money.
Yeah, that would be awesome. If you don't mind, and then you want to listen to this information, we can send your books out as well.
I'm starting to hear alien talk. Do you think they're closing us down after an hour? I couldn't hear that last comment.
Anyone who asks for more information, we'll send your books out as well if we have them in PDF form.
That's fine. I'm trying to get it out there.
Yeah. Well, this has been awesome. Thank you for taking an hour and spending it with us. I'm excited. We'll share this recording with you. But like I said, thanks for coming and spending some time with us.
Well, thank you, Jordan, for doing this and getting the word out. I mean, what could be more important? Jesus said, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit himself? I think we're talking about what life is all about, purpose and meaning in life. The death rate in America is really quite astounding. It's 100%. I mean, everybody's going to die. So we might as well face it rather than avoid the issue, and it's given me great comfort. I hope it helps others as well.
Yep, totally agreed. And I think NDEs is something, Christians should be talking about more and more just because, what is more compelling and more interesting to a skeptic or a non-believer than talking about things like this, where you really have to confront these deep questions of life and existence and consciousness and things of that nature. So thanks for spending time. I'm excited to share this, but yeah, we appreciate it, Steve.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Take care.
You too.